Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining our session today on how to use Azure Cache for Redis like a pro. This session isn't formatted like a tutorial, but instead it's going to be a collection of tips based off different stages of getting started and using Azure Cache for Redis. And I would love to introduce myself. My name is Carolina Uribe-Gosselin. I am one of the program managers on Azure Cache for Redis. I am primarily focused on improving developer experiences and integrations with other Azure services. And I am particularly passionate about getting involved with hackathons and development programs for students and mentorship opportunities. Now I'll hand it off to Yanmei to introduce herself.
Hi, this is Yanmei Wu. I'm one of the engineer lead on Azure Cache for Redis team. Previously, I worked in various different startups in Amazon. I'm very passionate about empowering developers to build highly available and scalable cloud-native application with the Azure services.
Awesome, thank you. So in today's session, I'll give you all a little brief overview on what Azure Cache for Redis is. We're also going to talk about Contoso, a fictional company that we fabricated to talk about those different questions that we've seen over the years, and hopefully they'll resonate with you. And we'll also be talking about the tips that we have for those particular questions. So Azure Cache for Redis is the managed version of Redis running on Azure. And to highlight a couple of the main benefits, first one being that it complements App Service, Azure databases, and other data stores. It's also highly available with low latency access to your data. And it makes apps more scalable and flexible at a lower cost than you may pay otherwise. So let me introduce you now to Contoso. Contoso is a startup based in Seattle, Washington. They have an online food delivery service, and they are eager to help people discover local food establishment gems in their neighborhood. And they approached us because they're a smaller startup right now, but they are anticipating a lot of growth in the coming months. And they're looking about using Azure Cache Redis into their application, so they wanted to see our best practices. So when Yanmei and I met with the team, they had 4 main categories of questions that they were curious about. One was planning, development, management, and then monitoring their cache. So I first met with the CTO and the head of IT to discuss their business needs around planning. Their primary question was, what should they be considering when choosing a cache offering? Because when they're first getting started, they're going to be using it in a dev and test environment. But then, of course, they'll be moving on to putting Azure Cache for Redis in a production environment. And then they were also curious about what region they should be locating their cache instance in. When we talked to them about our different offerings, we shared that we have 5 different offerings that they can choose from, highlighting that the basic tier is the best one for those development and testing needs that they have. That's because there is no replication, it's at a lower cost, and there's no high availability. But once they're able to move on to having it in production, that's where standard and premium come in. Standard and premium both have built-in replication. They are both highly available, and the main difference between the two of them is that the premium has more features available to them. Features such as data persistence, clustering, zone redundancy, and then georeplication. We also just announced the general availability of 2 new tiers in partnership with Redis Labs. That is the Enterprise and Enterprise Flash tiers. And these 2 tiers have all the goodness that Premium comes with additionally a couple more features. Those features are active georeplication, which unlocks up to 5.9 availability, which is in preview. And then we also have the Redis modules on the Enterprise tier. And those Redis modules are Redis Search, Redis Bloom, and Redis Time Series. And then Enterprise Flash runs on Redis on Flash. Then when talking to them about where to locate their cache, which is the physical location where their cache resides, We are proud to share that Azure has over 60 available regions, and since their application is based in West US, we mentioned that you should locate your cache instance in the same region as their application. So that will be in the West US, which will reduce their latency and increase performance. Now handing it off to Yanmei, who met with the engineering dev team.
Hey, thank you, Carolina. Yeah, so we had a chat with Contoso's engineering team, and so they were asking questions related to what the data structure should be when I'm putting the data into Redis Cache for fast read and write. What are the best practices when connecting to Redis Cache? And what should I be considering when running kind of Redis command for diagnosis purposes? In terms of key size, larger key sizes lead to fragmentation of memory space. And also, reading the large key value entries from Redis requires greater data transfer over the network. So our recommendation for data structure to store the data in Redis is to stay as small as possible. And our recommended recommendation is to stay below 100 gigabytes. So you can considering using larger key value entries, and those are just like some consequences to take into consideration. For example, it takes more time to transfer the data, so your client may need to have a higher timeout value config to allow for this additional transfer time. Request made to the server on the same TCP connection can get stuck behind the big transfer and cause the other request to time out. And also, your network buffers used to transfer those data can impact availability memory on the client or server, which can aggravate the available memory issues, which are already described around fragmentations. So those are just considerations that you need to keep in mind. Next, for connection management. Development team usually use open source client library to connect to Redis Cache. And creating a new connection to connect to Redis Cache is an expensive operation, which usually comes with increased latency. And our recommendation is to reuse the connection when possible. And if you choose to create a new connection, make sure to close the old connection before you release them. And there are usually a typical scenario for connection pooling. For example, your application can create 10 to 100 connections in the connection pooling. And then once your connection done with the connection, to retrieve the data, release that connection back to the connection pool for your other application to start reuse those connections. Next one is to avoid the expensive commands. So Redis command processing is a single-threaded. So command that took a long time to run will certainly blocking all the commands that come after it. Our recommendation is to replace the expensive command with more performant alternatives. For example, instead of using keys, you can use scans or hscans. And our general rule of thumb or recommendation is to avoid big O-N commands because those are usually pretty expensive operations. For detailed information on the complexity of a certain command, you can refer to redis.io documentation for further information. Now I'm going to hand it off to Carolina, who had a conversation with their IT team for how to manage their cache effectively on the prod environment.
Thanks, Yanmei. So yeah, when connecting with the IT team, they share with us their concerns with, we're an organization and we're expecting growth within our teams. And how can they ensure that all caches created in their organization are secure? They also want to know how they can ensure their caches are resilient to disasters and planned updates. We were really excited to talk to them about Azure Private Link for Azure Cache for Redis, which has recently become generally available. And with Azure Private Link, it eliminates data exposure to the public internet. So this is perfect. This is great. This is the Azure standard for data security, and it's works really well with Azure Cache Redis, and it supports scaling operations. So customers can actually reuse their private endpoints. So if they're scaling up their cache instance, they can maintain that same private endpoint. It also supports like geo-replication, firewall rules, and clustering. And when we told them about this, they said this is wonderful, but how can we ensure that all caches are using Azure Private Link? And this is where bulk management options for security came in. We now have these Azure Private Link policies that can be used to prevent specific human errors. Our recommendation is to take a look at these policies and see which ones best work for your organization. For their specific example, I told them that there's a policy that will actually deny the creation of a cache instance if it does not have a private endpoint on it. And I will give you all a demo on how that works. So when you go to your Azure portal, you can go up into the search bar and search for policy. And when you go to the policy, what you would do is you would go to definitions. And in definitions, you would search for Redis. And the policies that you see here are the built-in policies that our team created. And for this demo, I'll be showing you all the one that will prevent the cache from being created if it doesn't have the private endpoint. And what you do is you just assign the definition. You choose the resource and subscription. So I'm going to go ahead and choose mine. And then from here, you can choose the assignment name and description and change it for what works best for your organization. And I'm going to choose the parameter as deny because I do not want any caches to be created without this private endpoint. And then here's where you put the non-compliance message. So this is the message that your team's going to see when they try to make a cache without a private endpoint. So I'm going to put Azure Cache for Redis requires a private endpoint. So from there, I can create it. And it's quite quick. As you can see, it's already created this policy. So now if I go to create a cache instance, right over here, I'll just quickly create one with my information. I will be locating it in East US. And now in this networking tab for my connectivity method, I'm going to leave it as a public endpoint. And then when I go to review and create this cache instance, it's going to try to deploy this cache, but immediately it's going to tell me that the deployment failed. And your team can go here and click here for more details. And that's where it's going to show that message that you inputted earlier in the policy blade. So that's how you use policies. And to go back to the presentation, the next topic that we had covered with them was planned updates. Because planned updates are always going to happen, and network blips will potentially occur on your application at this time. And we share with them that we now have this pub sub notification that's going to allow them to handle those network blips gracefully. So our recommendation was to set up their application to subscribe to Azure Redis events, which will allow them to implement a circuit breaker pattern by proactively migrating their connections to either another cache instance they may have or a database. And it will give about a 30-second notice. So that's before one of these events may happen. They're also curious about different event deliveries. So for Redis Cache events like patching, scaling, import, and export, there used to not be a way for their event handler to know once those events completed. So that's where we share with them that Azure Event Grid is about to become generally available, and with Azure Event Grid, they can subscribe their event handler, such as Azure Functions, Logic Apps, or even their own HTTP listener to get notifications once the event completes. This is going to allow them to streamline automation, and it made the IT team pretty happy to know this. Then Contoso was like, hey, we are also using a couple of our Azure Cache for Redis instances as a data store. What should we be considering if we're using it as a data store? We told them that in that situation, you will be wanting to persist your data because since Redis is stored in memory, there can be data loss during disasters. And data persistence will allow them to persist their data stored in Redis. So our recommendation was that if they are using Azure Cache for Redis as a data store, that they should use data persistence to ensure their data is being persisted to an Azure storage account. And we also talked about how if you're using RDB persistence, you can choose the frequency of when that data is being persisted. That can be like 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, but we shared that they should use 15 minutes because the higher frequency you have and the data is being persisted, of course the data will be a little bit stale, but it will be the most recent snapshot of that data. We also mentioned to them that if they're using Redis as a data store, beyond just data persistence, they're also going to be considering high availability options for their cache instance. And there's another session here at Redis Conference about using Azure Cache Redis in enterprise workloads. So if you're interested in learning more about high availability options in Azure Cache Redis, I highly recommend that you check out that session as well. And now handing off to Yanmei to talk about the IT team that she met with, where they discussed the different monitoring options and questions they had.
Thank you, Carolina. Yes, now Contoso had their Redis Cache production running for a while, and they applied those best practices and also like easy to manage. Now they coming to mind, how can I monitor my Redis Cache? And also, as Contoso's business is growing from a startup to a mid-sized company, they are seeing kind of increasing demand in different geolocations. So they came to mind on how to scale and when to scale, what type of scaling that they need to do. For monitoring your cache, so we sometimes get customers mention not very clear on what are the metrics to monitor, especially if they have a small IT team, and also like how to alerting on certain like monitors and what action to take when certain threshold was met in their monitor dashboard. Our recommendation is to use the building metrics from the insight from Azure monitoring and setting the alert to the metrics. Currently, we're supporting email notification, calling a webhook, or invoke a Azure Logic apps for your IT automation. For example, scaling up as needed. We also provide Azure Advisor for recommendations. This is a pretty unique feature, which we will be based on the traffic pattern to your Redis cache and prescribe the recommendations on what the action that you can do next. Scaling your cache is really easy. To keep up with the Contoso's growing application needs, Azure provided a scaling operation in the portal with just a simple clicks, which you can do very simple click scaling up or scaling out as needed. So based on our chat with our customers for best practices, we often recommend to scaling up when you're reaching a memory threshold. For example, if you reach memory threshold over 80%, this is when at the point that you should consider scaling up to upper skills. And when you encounter CPU or server load threshold, for example, CPU's threshold is exceeding 60%, and in this case, we'll be suggesting enable clustering, or that adding more cluster node of your existing clustering. And this is to increase the compute capacity to handle your for your in-demand needs. I'm going to do a demo here to show how easy it is to monitor and then do the scaling. So here I have a cache which is previously created. So when I click into the management blade of my existing cache, so if I go to Insight under the monitoring, I can see all the built-in metrics that is already being created for me, including the server load, CPU usage, memory usage, and also the connected client. So this gives the IT team a one centralized dashboard, can see the health of their Redis cache in one place. Azure Advisor recommendations, here is when you can see what the recommendation that you can do here. Previously, I loaded this cache and I ran a benchmark to creating traffic hitting my cache to put it at a stage of reaching the memory threshold situation. Here I got a description on what I can do here. It mentioned the impact is medium. When I click onto that, the recommended action take me to scale your cache to a different size or scale. And when I click on that, it takes me to the scaling blade. Now you can see that I'm currently at a C1 standard, and based on the traffic that I put the stress onto the cache, I can either scaling up to the same tier with larger memory sizes or different tiers with premium. Inside premium, that you can unlock the features for clustering, which enable to have multiple nodes in the clustering. So that's for my demo. For further detailed information, we publish Azure Cache best practices on our website. Also, we have a running documentation on Azure Cache FAQ. So if you have further questions, you can refer to those websites from Microsoft website. Also, we have Redis.io. You can check out all the latest releases and time complexity of the command information inside Redis Cache IO website as well. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.